Are Ontario's schools systematically racist? That's the claim made by the Ontario Human Rights Commission in a report that points to things like slavery, hate crime statistics, and anecdotal accounts as proof that racism isn't just present, but it's baked into the system. But a new report by the Aristotle Foundation says that's not quite what the data says. Today I'm joined by Matthew Lau of the Aristotle Foundation, who's challenging the OHRC's central premise. Lau's study shows that the Commission confuses individual prejudice with systemic discrimination, without actually proving the existence of racist policies in today's schools. The real question is, if the public system is so irredeemably racist, why not give families the freedom to leave it? I'm Melanie Bennet. This is Disrupted. Matthew, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I was just telling you how much I appreciate the study that you did for the Aristotle Foundation. And it was something that I was actually looking at. I believe it came out in March, around then, of last year. And it was a report from the Ontario Human Rights Commission called Dreams Delayed, which claimed that the Ontario schooling system was rife with systemic racism, with all these incidents. But perhaps we could start by explaining to the audience what is the Dreams Delayed report.
So the Dreams Delayed report was a report by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is a provincial government agency, and it's essentially their action plan for addressing what they call systemic anti-Black racism and discrimination in the public school system. So according to the action plan, there's laws and policies and practices in the school system that perpetuate prejudices or stereotypes or other forms of discrimination against Black people. So that was really, the claim when I saw it that I found didn't sit right with me, and I wanted to examine whether there was evidence for this very significant claim that they're making about the education system.
You quoted some bits from the report that I'm just going to read out to you again, because I think they're interesting. They tell a lot about this report and where it's coming from. It says that the OHRC posits that anti-Black racism is rooted in European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, that it led to systemic anti-Black racism being embedded in power structures in Canada, which perpetuate advantages for people of European descent, and that this is translated into the curriculum, which is focused exclusively on European history. And in your study, you go over a little bit about the slave trade and how that's affected Canada.
Yeah. So there's a few pieces here. First, it is true that historically we did have slavery in Canada, but thankfully laws that tried to restrict slavery were passed in Canada as early as 1793, and by 1834 slavery was outright abolished in Canada. So it is a historical fact that we had slavery in Canada. As to the degree to which it might have effects on society today is rather harder to draw a connection given how long ago it was. And if you look at historical slavery in Canada, it amounted to, across several centuries, at most 7,500 people, of which most of them were in New France, and about 35% of those slaves were Black. So again, it is true that we had historical slavery in Canada, but several thousand people 200 years ago is bad, but I don't think that it has anything connected to the education system or society today. So that's really the point I wanted to draw out about the racism, systemic racism in schools. I don't think it has anything to do with historical slavery.
Who were the rest of the slaves, if they were only 35% Black? I guess there was Indigenous and possibly
There were Indigenous Canadians, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the elements that you talk about is hate crimes, because that comes up a lot when we talk about systemic racism. And in your report, you were talking about how disparities, or sorry, how hate crimes are affecting the Black community, and comparing that to maybe some other groups.
Exactly. So if you look at the past decade of hate crimes, and this is police reported hate crimes. This is the Statistics Canada data set. And, it's been trending up for many groups, including Black people, the Jewish population. And if you look at police reported hate crimes as a whole, it is up very significantly in the past decade. But, the Ontario Human Rights Commission tried to say, well, it was up a certain percentage year over year for the Black community, and it sometimes goes up and it sometimes goes down, and overall while the long-term trend is up, it's up for all groups. So I don't think there's anything in particular about hate crimes against a Black community that is evidence of systemic racism. Certainly not to do with the education system, right? Hate crimes tend to be individual acts, right? Somebody goes out and commits a crime because they hate people of a certain identifiable group. That's very different from systemic racism, which has to do with the policies or procedures of an institution.
Maybe we could dig into that a little bit, because we're talking about systemic racism and hate crimes and slavery and all this stuff, but maybe we could define a little bit more what systemic racism is. Because a lot of times when people think about racism, they're thinking about maybe somebody having a bigoted opinion of a racial minority.
Yeah, so if somebody has a bigoted opinion of a minority group, that is an individual act or an individual feeling of racism. Systemic racism really means when it's the rules or policies or procedures of an institution. So, for example, the Human Rights Commission gave some examples of, people were called racial slurs. And those are examples of individual racism. No doubt they are bad and we should try to curtail them. But that's very different, say, from a school board having a policy that discriminates against Black people. Those are two very different things.
Yeah, so for systemic discrimination, if you're trying to eliminate systemic discrimination, what you're trying to do is that you are trying to, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to reshape a system towards something different. Right. So with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the goal of, I guess, disrupting and dismantling systemic racism is to reshape the system towards something else. Now, what that something else is, we can maybe dig into a little bit, because with schools, one of the things that they do through surveys and through data collection is they look at disparities. So disparities between different categories, right? So is one group achieving lower grades than another group? And what tends to happen is that if there's a difference between those groups, say maybe boys are not achieving as well in literacy than girls for whatever reason, then that would be saying that the boys are being systemically discriminated against because their group is not achieving as much. So is that a fair assessment of disparities?
Well, we have to draw a difference between disparities and discrimination, right? So just because there are disparities between groups doesn't mean that there's any systemic discrimination. The example I always like to give is that if you look at life expectancies in Canada over the past century, the life expectancies for women is much longer than it is for men. About 100 years ago, women tended to live about 2 years longer than men. If you look at 50 years ago, the life expectancy at birth for women was about 7 years longer than it was for men. And now it's back down to about 4. So if we wanted to tell a story about these differences are all due to discrimination, we would have to say that Canadian society has discriminated against men for 100 years, and that the discrimination was increasing in its severity from approximately 1920 to 1970. And since 1970, it's been decreasing in severity. Well, I don't see any evidence of that. I don't think it's because of, systemic discrimination that there's disparities in life expectancy. And I would apply, the same logic to the school system or to many other outcomes that we see. Just because two different groups are achieving different things doesn't mean that the system is biased or discriminates against one group or the other.
So this is why I use that example, the boys and the girls, because we don't often hear that men are being discriminated against. We typically hear that, especially so-called white men are at the top of the chain of in privilege and so on and so forth. So I'm glad you brought up that example as well, because what we're hearing is that certain groups are being discriminated against in school because there's disparities between certain groups, and that's a narrative that is well absorbed by most people. It's assumed by most people, but I think it would be interesting to take us through some of the data that you looked at from data collection in the schools themselves. So this is the data that the schools are collecting about these different groups.
Right. So the purpose of the collection of the data was really to evaluate this claim that the Human Rights Commission made, that people of European descent are unfairly advantaged in the school system because of the way the curriculum is formed or instruction or for any other reason, right? So we looked, for example, the Peel District School Board has published very recent data on this, and as to how their students perform on EQAO tests. EQAO is the provincial agency that issues standardized tests. And what we find is that the highest performing groups are Southeast Asian and South Asian and East Asian students, who outperform the white students, actually, in the Peel District School Board. Again, we looked, there was another school board that published data. This was the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. And again, it was the East and Southeast Asian and the South Asian students who had, on average, the highest performance on EQAO tests. So when we see this data, it does not jive with this narrative that the Human Rights Commission is putting out, that it's people of European descent who are unfairly advantaged by the school system. Well, if the Asian kids are scoring the highest on tests, doesn't make sense.
And so, if we go back to the Human Rights Commission report, do they give any other reasons for disparities?
Well, they don't try to look at. I think it was beyond the scope of their report as to why different groups might achieve different things. The report was not really a dig into disparities. It kind of assumed that, well, there's systemic discrimination and now we have to tackle it. And it held up the disparities as proof of the systemic discrimination. But to me, it's very flimsy.
Yeah, but I guess that's why I was asking, because if we're told all the time that there's systemic discrimination in schools, that Black people are the most discriminated against, although there's some other groups that get mentions quite frequently. And then when you look at the data, it's not necessarily always the case that this is what's going on. And so what other reasons might be behind why there are differences between groups? And I'm not seeing that in a lot of the official documentation. You would expect the Ontario Human Rights Commission, an official body that has a lot of influence, to have some of that information. And I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have.
Well, there are many different reasons why people achieve different outcomes, right? It's some of them are cultural differences. So, for example, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the case for one group or the other, but some cultures may emphasize playing music or playing sports as opposed to academic performance. There's family income and the level of education that your parents attained would be play a big role into the educational achievement of students. So there are many different factors, and just saying, well, it's because of racism in schools and systemic racism, to me, that doesn't make much sense at all.
Yeah. And one of the things that you do bring up is the difference between the individual instances of racism. And so that might be back to some kind of bigotry, right? Or so there's a negative stereotype, maybe there's a comment, or these individual instances between students, or maybe between teachers, and so on and so forth within a school, which is very, very different from the systemic racism. This idea that the way that policies and rules and curriculum are developed specifically to elevate a particular racial group, right? So that is one thing that you bring up in the report. But what might be some recommendations then to improve that? Because right now, what I'm seeing with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, this particular Dreams Delight, and also has a compendium of recommendations. There's a few things that are attached to this. And the compendium of recommendations are largely from community groups, but they are, some of them are completely wild, what they're asking for, on the basis of this systemic discrimination that can't be found in the data. But it's being used by many different groups to ask for things like removing police officers from schools, right? Well, we know that violence incidents are going up. And so what would be the recommendations? How could we address this situation? Because we're dealing with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which many people just take at face value.
Yeah, as you say, the Ontario Human Rights Commission gave a very long list of recommendations, most of which I don't remember, but included things like, having teachers' colleges recruit based on some diversity targets, for example, and, a whole host of, diversity training and these types of recommendations. The recommendation or the policy that I would prefer and that I've long supported for the education system is if there's something wrong with the government-run education system, the public education system, Ontario should, as other provinces currently do, provide more support for parents who want to access alternatives to the public school system. So, for example, in Alberta and BC and some other provinces, if a family decides that a private school or another type of school is best suited for their child, they can send their child there, and some of the taxes that they pay will go and be used to fund that education. Right now in Ontario, there's no such option. If you want to send your child to a different school, whether it's because you think your school is racist or the teachers are not giving proper instruction or the academics are no good, or for whatever reason, if you want to send your kids to another school, you have to pay twice. First, in taxes for the school that your kid doesn't go to, and then second, for the tuition for the private school that you do want to send your kid to, right? If you're paying taxes, we're all paying taxes to educate the kids. To me, if the parents decide to send the kids somewhere else, they should still get that tax money to educate their kids.
Yeah, you raise a really, really good point there, because some of the loudest people calling schools systemically racist or claiming all of this, these attacks on marginalized groups tend to be the people who are very much against different forms of education. So whether that be a charter school or just any pod homeschooling, whatever it is, these tend to be the people who are against this the most. So it does raise the question, if schools are so systemically racist, if they're so rotten, why can't we give parents different options to access maybe a non-racist or a better education system?
Other provinces do this, and you mentioned charter schools, and in Alberta they do have something like a dozen charter schools, which even though they're government funded, they're autonomously run, and those charter schools have very long waiting lists because parents are banging on the doors to get in.
Yeah, that's great. Well, perhaps we'll see something like that pop up. I think choice is always interesting. I think some unions might be against that, but it would certainly be interesting to bring that to Ontario. Matthew, I appreciate the discussion so much, and I appreciate the report so much, and you should all go read it. Thank you very much. And there you have it. The systemic discrimination that we're told about isn't easily seen in the data, and yet important organizations, influential organizations like the Ontario Human Rights Commission, are getting their information from somewhere. But it seems these days we're not so much relying on evidence, we're relying on activism. If you liked today's show, I would love to hear your experiences with systemic discrimination in schools or the claims thereof. And if you liked this show, please like, subscribe, and share with other people. I'll see you in the next one.